everyone. Welcome to this edition of The Value Exchange. I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Annabelle. Annabelle,
Hello, everyone.
as she almost didn't say anything. And I'm really excited today to introduce Jon Husband as our special guest. Jon and Ethos have known each other for, it seems like a long time. It is a long time. Jon is a coach, consultant, writer, public speaker, focused on how humans interact with each other and increasingly organizing in networks to get things done. Up until the mid 90s, he acted as a senior principal for the Hay Group in London, which is where he was at the time. He's now based in Canada. And he worked on and for a number of nationals and multinationals on HR strategy, leadership, and management. For, I guess, 25 plus years now, he's been deeply involved in the web, blogging, wikis, collaborative work platforms, and looking at sociological, psychological, behavioural implications of managing in a networked environment. He's the inventor of a term called Wirearchy. And I'm going to hand over to Jon to more slowly introduce himself and and then I'm going to pass to Annabelle for questions. So here we go. Jon, do you want to
Hello.
say
Hello from Montreal. Spring is just begun. Thank you for the very nice introduction. Yeah, I'm still. I mentioned getting older, and I'm approaching 70, but I'm still paying attention to the things that fascinated me. I think when I was a teenager, which is why do people do what they do? You know, what does work mean? And it's interesting because I'm sort of the father, not the actual father, but sort of the father of a 14-year-old boy now who's very bright and facing a world that I did not face 60 some years ago. And wondering about that, and wondering about what kind of work he'll do, and what kind of work he'll want, and so on and so forth, while making your way in the world. And it's not at all evident to anyone what that's going to be like. What I find interesting these days is that there's people roughly of my generation that are starting to find it difficult to cope with all the changes that have been accumulating in their lives in the past 20 years. And we're seeing various forms of that erupt in all sorts of sociological ways, whether it's violence, whether it's free speech and hate issues, whether it's immigration. We're seeing the effects of massively connected flows of information put on screens in front of us almost everywhere we go, whether it's an elevator, the back of a taxi cab, some billboard, bus stops, information and prompts for us to engage with something, whether it's mentally or emotionally, are all around us. We're bathing in them. And they are at the same time, I think they are bringing some possibilities of coherence to us. It's forcing us to make choices about how we're going to work, how we're going to live, what we value and what we don't. And on the other hand, it is, and I think more clearly to most people, because of the past that they remember, it is tearing us apart, fragmenting us, individualizing and atomizing us. So we're having to contend with these shifts. And this is a way for me to begin to start talking about Wirearchy, because what I started noticing all that, and I was working at the time when I was very interested in what futurists were calling the coming information age. I was working with a company that was the purveyor of probably the most dominant method for creating hierarchies, for what I call a genericizing, making generic general Taylorism, as it's encoded into assumptions about work design, status, efficiency, productivity, and so on. And the more I read, and then along came the internet, the more I got uh, both, I suppose, worried and agitated and very interested in what was going on. And the internet, of course, has changed many, if not most, aspects of our lives. I often reflect on the fact that it may be people like us who are the last people who had screen and information free summers when we were children or teenagers to pass. We had to find ways to pass the day without walking around looking at a screen in front of us. So all of this has been, kind of a pretty natural interest for me because I'm still paying attention to what people do, why they do it, and how they do it. And I've managed to avoid um, making a business out of it or trying to become, a top 50 thinker or speaker because I'm basically pretty lazy and I like kind of going through daily life and swimming and doing other things without working too much. So I haven't worked very much for the last 15 or 20 years. Spoken a bit here and there and collaborated with a few people, but have not done all that much. What's interesting to me about the last 20 years is that this crazy made up word that I popped into my head one day and wrote a few things about has continued to be used here and there by other people. It's not been commercialized, and I hope it never will be, although there have been a couple of large consulting companies that have put it on the masthead of a couple of their white papers. Um, and I suspect that it just becomes more and more evident. I've had people ring me up from the past and say, "Oh, I see better now what you were talking about." Um,
Jon, for the purposes of the tape, as they say in all the best cop movies, can you explain a little what you mean by Wirearchy
indeed,
and how you came up with that?
indeed. I started with reading a lot of the early books about learning organizations. People like Peter Senge or Harry DeGoose or Margaret Wheatley and Charles Handy. Charles Handy being a particular hero of mine. And there was a real inflection point or tipping point. I think I've told both you and Rob this story before, but I was just shortly after my 40th birthday when I was living in London at the flagship office of Hay. One of my team leader came to me and said, "This isn't a guarantee, but we're thinking of uh, putting your name up for a partner." And of course, when you're a consultant, that's what you start aiming for when you're a young consultant. I was a little bit more than a decade into my career, and I found that I couldn't sleep for the next week or two because I started realizing that at 40, what that meant was that the next 20 years would be spent in a dark blue suit with a tie on and trying to sell bigger and bigger projects for methods that I was believing less and less and less in because of this belief of mine that we were working with the generic codifications of Taylorism, and it looked to me like Taylorism was going to be at a minimum questioned and at a maximum overridden eventually by something else. And so I ended up quitting, which was uh, an extremely stupid move on my part in many, many ways. It blew my life apart. It got rid of my lifetime to things we call salaries. It forced me to move countries back to Canada and so on. But I couldn't stop thinking about all this stuff. And it just made sense to me at that time. There was a magazine called Wired that had just come out. And just like artificial intelligence now, people were talking about the coming information age and the World Wide Web and the internet and the dot-com boom. This was before the dot-com bust. At any rate, I started wondering about archy, and there's about 6 or 7 archy words. I started thinking about the meaning of archy, which is structure or order, like monarchy, heterarchy, hierarchy, monarchy, which is very pertinent tomorrow, and so on. And I realized that they reflected, or they symbolized, the archy word symbolized the architecture of life under a certain set of conditions, if you will. And so I started thinking wired, and then it just sounded a lot like hierarchy, and it sounded like what was going to be helping what we understand as hierarchy evolve in an information age. And that's very much what I think now, is that there won't be an elimination or a replacement of hierarchy. There will be an evolution of it. And that means a number of different things. Uh, I penned a working definition at that time, about 20 some years ago, and it still pretty much stands. It's a dynamic two-way flow of power and authority based on knowledge, trust, credibility, and a focus on results. And I maintain that if you take a look at those four factors that I've named, you could write 1,000 books about each one of them, and there have been, about knowledge, about trust, about credibility, and about a focus on results. But I would argue that in many, many examples we see unfolding in front of us, for example, the changes in Twitter due to ownership and a different direction of management, and so on, are all about this shift in power from a one-way, typically top-down, even if it's invisible and unsaid, power and authority that's used in making many, many decisions, to an ongoing evolution to some kind of dialogic responses to more and more complex situations. And we see that. We see an awful lot more participatory process today than we did 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. And we see an awful lot more pushback. And we'll see people launch things to start debates, start arguments, and so on. I mean, I'm being polite because there's obviously a lot of garbage and shit talked back and forth on networks, social networks in this area, but they're not going away, and we are going to have to learn how to work with them and within them in order to get things done. I mean, that seems glaringly evident now, and we're facing another significant change in that dynamic. I think the same elements will be still in play. If we look at ChatGPT-4, for example, knowledge, trust, credibility, focus on results, they're all in play.
Jon, I think you've really got my brain kind of all over the place, which is fantastic. It's the best place for my brain to be all mushy. This sort of more dialogue and change in dynamics, is it perceivable to most people, or is this kind of like, I always give the terrible analogy of boiling a frog in hot water, where you start with cold water and you raise the temperature gradually, and the frog evidently doesn't know that it's dead or dying, because its in temperature is increasing gradually. It's a rubbish story, but everybody seems to tell it, and I don't know how the frog can tell us what it was like. Are we able to sense this change, do you think? Do you have examples of how we can sense it rather than story tell it? Because that's really exciting if we've got if we can help people sense it more. Because on the one hand, there's another story with Elon Musk, which is, long live the dictator. Forget the shareholders. This is absolute monarchy in action, isn't it? This is kind of this is back to the old archy. I just want to run it in a dictatorial fashion myself. I don't want anybody involved in that. But nevertheless, there's a big dialogue happening, a big dialogue about the future of Twitter, because at the end of the day, it needs people to participate.
And so the question is,
how do we are we the frog being boiled where we can't sense it, or can we sense this change Do you have examples of how we can see it, feel it, touch it? What
So
should we look
so I
for?
think the way I would respond to your question is yes and yes, uh, uh, or both and, in the sense that, I mean, it's something I often wonder about because, since we last talked, the whole working from home and remote working argument has reared its head. And
Gone
well,
away
I
almost.
don't agree with that. Just yesterday, I posted something, I think, on Twitter, where I don't know if you know, he probably didn't, because Canada only hits the news in the UK once or twice a year. Um, but there was a fairly significant strike of about a week or 2 weeks length recently in Canada by public servants, public sector workers in the government of Canada. And it was settled yesterday. And part of the settlement is that forms of hybrid work, including remote, uh, are part of the agreement. So it's kind of here to stay. I think the public service is Canada's largest employer, and so on. So we're see, and a fellow in the UK. Did you ever meet Greg Broham? I no. I can send it to you. He and I wrote a piece on LinkedIn probably about 9 months ago about the effect of COVID and remote working and so on, and that the upshot, mostly of it, is that in this era of accelerating automation, algorithmization, and efficiency seeking, what people are looking for beyond uh, the basic security of a paycheck and being able to pay for their mortgage and their food is a sense of belonging. And I think that's something that you've touched on with, value exchanges. How do I express my mission in the world? Um, so I think that when I said yes and yes, what I see is I live in a city where there's a great deal of social activism in neighborhoods and around environmental and political issues, and particularly language, identity, culture, and power issues, because we have a French city and a French province, but there's English people and people from many other countries that live here as well. And there have been some fairly unhappy pieces of legislation passed in the last few years that are seen to be diminishing Anglophone rights and so on. Uh, I bring that up because whenever I go for a walk, and often when I'm sitting around, I think of all the places I've been. I think I've been to maybe 50 cities and 30 countries in the last 20 years, thanks to Wirearchy in general. And the big cities that I've been in, the traffic jams, the people rushing to and fro, uh, then accounting for COVID, but back to that. And then I think of people um, sitting behind their computers, working all around the world again. And I think of the rise of what are called gig workers and gig economy. I don't know if you ever saw a book called The Gig Mindset Advantage by Jane McConnell. It's a very, very good book. She lives in the south of France, Rob, and it's highly recommended that you get in touch, the two of you get in touch with her. It's a very, very good book based on very solid research. And it's an example of how people have responded in the last 20 years to these issues, which a gig worker and the gig economy, there are a couple of meanings to it. One of them is just that there's a lot of short-term jobs and people move from job to job and so on. But the gig mindset that Jane talks about is that in all sorts of big companies, and I think this started happening 20 years ago, there are people that know that there's a not insignificant chance that I might lose my job, like the layoffs that are happening now with Shopify and IBM and all sorts of places. And there have been waves of that over the years where, if the economy tightens up, there's layoffs and so on. So nobody is really sure that their job is steady, or they're working somewhere where they don't like the culture. The culture may be toxic, or they don't like their manager. At any rate, this notion of a gig mindset is while I'm working where I'm working, I'm also busy maintaining my contacts, working my network, keeping my eye open for the next things that I might like or that I might like better, or so on. And this has become endemic, and it has become a part of uh, the workforce landscape in at least in Europe and North America. It's something that a fellow, I think he's dead now, called William Bridges wrote about 30 years ago in a couple of books. He was very famous for writing about job transition. I think his book was called Transitions by what's his name again? William Bridges. Um, and I think that was before there was a book called "How What Color Is Your Parachute," which was about jumping out of
Yes.
your employment into your next employment. Well, that's just become regular, and particularly both of you I know have children. I just spent a week with my nephew who's 27. They see the world differently now. They know it. They know it. They know that things have changed much better than we do. And this is part of my yes answer. I think, from what I see here in Montreal and what I've participated in elsewhere, when you get to about 35 and under, or maybe 30, they are much more used to talking in circles, participating, working in effectively non hierarchical ways together as groups. That might not be in companies, but it's in all sorts of initiatives all over the place. Michel Bovens may have talked about this as well. Most initiatives that are looking at alternative or new or emerging economies and communities are also working in dialogic and participative processes. So there's a lot of people that know things are different and that are busy working on their own ways of adapting to this new environment. And then there's an awful lot of old people or older people and people in organizations still clinging to the notions of status and power and I'm really busy, I'm really productive, and so on. Excuse me. It's a very, very interesting landscape because we're now facing very significant impact again from the algorithms known as chatbots and how they are going to affect an awful lot of relatively routinized white collar work and administrative work. And along with that, there'll be people, probably Michel Bovens, but certainly people like David Graeber and others who have said, well, when we get to that world, some form of universal basic income is fundamentally necessary. And as an old person now, what I see is that and I think this argument's been advanced before. There's already in countries like the UK, certainly in Canada, less so in the United States, many, many forms of social benefit that we receive. And of course, that's how I live now on my social security pension and my old age pension and so on. And one suspects that the cost of all of these programs lumped together for a given country will not be much more or will not be more than the plethora of different programs that already exist. So the question isn't can we afford it? The question becomes one of political will and power. So back to the frog in the boiling water. I think there are hordes of people that, and excuse my language here, that don't give a shit about all of this, just want to make it through the day, go home, spend time with their family. More and more people are living alone, or maybe they just want to watch TV all night, but they don't want to be bothered by all of this modern stuff. I just spent a week, as I said, with my nephew, but my brother, his father was also here. And my brother is very, very different than me. He just absolutely does not want to know anything about the online or in connected world. He uses it to watch a couple of channels on YouTube about motorcycles, but the rest of it, it just says, I don't enjoy this world. I don't want to know about it. Lives in his home, goes for walks every day, doesn't want to know about it. So he's probably in that boiling water, but he's probably got an insulating suit on. So I think there's all sorts of responses, but I think more and more people are seeing that, hey, we're either in hot water or, I've got to get out there and start adapting how I live and how I work to this.
Brilliant. I'm going to just move us on slightly. Thank you for that. So this podcast that we've early days with, experimenting with, running, it's sort of, we've created it as a place to sort of encourage, stories with reflect on perspectives of social value. That's sort of the mission is to get more social stories out there in the world. I just wondered what the contribution of Wirearchy might have been to date, in future, in that social value space. Can Wirearchies shine a light on more social value? And do you have any sort of stories, examples of where that might be the case?
Well, I don't think it's Wirearchy that's causing it. I think it's the fact that people are connected and are looking for ways to belong, whether that's belonging with ideas, belonging with values, just feeling seen. I think there's a lot of that. I think a lot of the kinds of commentary that you see on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, or where else is effectively people wanting to be seen. I remember. I think you'll remember this, Rob. I did a lot of work, probably about 10 years ago, translating the work of a man named Michel Cartier. Uh, but I remember when selfies started being uh, an issue or a thing, which was quite a while ago with cell phones. And Michel, I think, said something very, very astute. He said, well, the reason selfies are becoming popular and so many people are doing it is because people want to feel as if they exist in today's world. And that's something I reflect on often, because along with all of the re-engineering and what I call the algorithmization of our behaviors in everyday life, is this sense of becoming desensitized, numbed by the continuous onslaught of information and of impingement on our time and attention, which is another reason why people screen out. So, back to your question, I think that being connected, which basically blogging started, um, has been a very good way for all sorts of people to find others of their own mind, their own ilk, where they belong. And that, of course, has had very positive effects and very negative effects, because all the nasty people out there that have brought nasty to the social networks have found that way as well. And for that, one can say, well, the internet has certainly become some form of panopticon or omnopticon, where what it has done is revealed us to ourselves. We're not all nice people. And lots of people are very easily swayed by information. I remember all sorts of people. I mean, this is a much more complex issue, but I remember all sorts of people commenting when Trump was running and Trump was elected, or Johnson for that matter, and saying that the things that they were saying and felt free to say as leaders were going to have very pernicious effects in society. And they were going to open the lid for all sorts of similar utterings and behavior. And so this has happened. Um, which is really interesting when Elon Musk takes to the screen and says all he is interested in is the truth. Um, we'll see. It's very interesting. One could argue that you've probably seen that icky Venn diagram thing that says 1984, Brave New World, Fahrenheit 451, a couple other books, and then You Are Here right in the middle of it. I don't know if either of you have ever read the book Fahrenheit 451. You probably have. Rob's nodding his head. I first read it in my first or second year of university back in the 70s, and I thought it was a brilliant piece of science fiction. I reread it about 3 years ago, and then I reread it again about 6 weeks ago. I don't think it's science fiction anymore, and I'm serious about that. At the end of the book Fahrenheit 451, after Montag, the fireman, goes through, his betrayal of himself, and goes from living in a house with his wife, who's, and all the walls are screens, and she's talking about what everyone else said, and everyone else says this, and he gets more and more frantic, of course, and then he cops a couple books, and then the mechanical dog starts looking for him, and so on. But he ends up, if you remember this, on a riverbank out of the town after he's run away from the mechanical dog, and there he meets a whole bunch of hobos or people, all of whom who have memorized. I can't remember if it's a page or a chapter or the whole book. They've memorized all the classics because all the books are being burned. And so the book ends by saying, well, every time we burn ourselves down as a civilization, there's a few people we start again. And we're kind of, we're meandering in that area these days.
I think there's a general sense that that we're there. Rob is indulging in classics at the moment. It's,
but also reread 1984, An Animal Farm, and that, which are just, ikigai. We're in the center. And I'm not joking. I absolutely agree that we've either got to start writing algorithms for humanity that actually bring out the good bits, or we're going to just be the frog, or we're going to be the center of that story again.
Yep.
Because it's not possible for everybody to live on a farm without the internet. It's just I just don't see that we can live without
exactly.
this stuff.
So back to your question about there's certainly a lot more awareness that we're in more than tepid water at the moment. But there isn't, I don't think, widespread awareness because, there's cities on the planet like Istanbul with 15 or 20 million, and Mumbai and Sao Paulo, and then you have really effective governments like the Tory government in the UK who are bent on destroying the country. Before I forget,
in that way,
given the statement on your website about what Ethos is all about, have either of you read a novel called The Ministry for the Future? Go out and buy it and read it soon. It's written by a guy called, you may remember this name, he's quite a well-known science fiction writer, Kim Stanley Robinson. Do you know that name? Yeah. So it's his latest book. And it's The Ministry for the Future, not the Ministry of the Future. And it's I think one of the lines on the front cover of it from one of his reviewers is the best nonfiction novel, science fiction novel ever written. So we have nonfiction, science fiction, and novel. So it's a story. Excuse me. And it starts out very dire. It starts out in something like 2040 or 2030 something. And there's just been a massive heat wave in India where you probably know the term wet bulb temperatures above 35 for a month, and 50 million people die. So and I think some of us that have been talking about this keep saying there's not going to be deep change happen until a real catastrophe happens. So that let's say that qualifies as a catastrophe. 50 million people die in a month in India. That's the beginning of the book. And then it goes on. It's actually a very hopeful and optimistic book, but it sure doesn't feel like that until about 3/4 of the way through. But it's one of the most well-researched, logical, and passionate books I've ever read. It's very, very good. So
I'm waiting for the happy ending.
No, don't give the happy ending away. No.
Well, let's say that the catastrophe happens in India. We're currently in the middle of all sorts of gyrations about, a COP meeting every year, COP 27, COP 28, COP 29. And of course, all the time, lots of acknowledgement that not all that much is being done. and then we're going to miss targets and so on. So, what the book does is it presents the major issues and how people around the world push back on them for climate change. What some of the science that is possible. There's scenarios in which that might be done, but it also basically puts out the story that the catastrophe in India is so serious that India says, well, we're not going to necessarily play by the rules of everyone else. We're going to do our own thing. And it gets very, very serious about greening uh, the economy, greening the land, and it becomes a model for a way out of various issues of climate change. Um, and I won't go any further than that. It talks about also,
Excellent.
well, the
Sounds
other central part of the book is this notion. I think it's very intelligent and has been much discussed already, called a carbon coin, which goes along with the tokenization of the economy and all of the kinds of things that are happening now with NFTs and cryptocurrency and so on. There's a lot to keep track of, isn't there?
Oh yeah, so much, so much. So again, I'm just going to bring us back to value exchange hierarchy, if that's all right. So we've been on this journey for 24 years, and sort of had a lot of time to reflect ourselves into sort of the future of work and where we are with value exchange. And I think we would be safe in saying that our perspective is that hierarchies tend to sort of deconstruct work into sort of roles and jobs, and they're very fixed on work that needs to be done. And so we're interested in understanding whether you thought hierarchy can accommodate roles which are built for more for an individual, more taking a value exchange perspective. And again, have you got any examples, stories as to where that might be happening?
Um, I'm not sure because I haven't been all that active, but to come back to the beginning of your point, I mean, you're really touching on exactly where I was when I quit, because um, there when I talk about the genericization or the making generic of Taylorism, there are some core assumptions that excuse me that are uh, the foundation of Taylorism, and one of them, of course, is specialization of labor. And I think that's a major one, because if you look at the methods that are used to create jobs and org charts, it's still very much a job description where an individual is pointed to a set of tasks, often but not always, that are meant to be carried out somewhat in sequence or in some kind of order of priority. And that goes even with the less tangible accountabilities of white collar work. But the fundamental premise is still that there's a separation of labor. Um, what has happened in the last 20 years in the HR world was, starting about 25 years ago, there was a uh, fairly rapid shift to believing that uh, competency profiling would be an effective replacement for the job description, because they're really taking the traits of successful performers, codifying them in statements about how you act, how you think, how you be, um, and giving those to job holders. But job evaluation and job descriptions remained, because they are still the mechanism for placing you at an appropriate salary level and into an appropriate arrangement of schemes if there's bonuses and other kinds of perks, benefits, or add-ons that go with a role. And as that happened, it became more and more evident that there were uh, constraints from these tools. And in fact, I wrote an essay some time ago. I think Rob's read it in the past, called "Semantic Straitjackets: How Management Science has reduced or limit, I don't know, had negative impact on creativity, responsiveness, and innovation," something like that. Um, it's a thorny question because people need something to attach their attention and energy to, which would typically be the purpose or the focus of the role. The word purpose has been tossed around a lot lately for about the fourth time in my working life, um, because it's supposed to keep you on purpose and keep your energies concentrated and lead to productivity. And if that were the case, then every job description that's been written for the last 40 years, the first part of it is the purpose of the role or the purpose of the job. as uh, as these tools have become less and less effective because we're in this swirling turbulence of connected flows and jobs that change, projects that change, jobs that are lost, new jobs that are created, and so on and so forth. Some organizations started using what are called role profiles, which are, I suppose, a form of job description. I mean, the title gives it all away. The first time I started using those was probably about 25 years ago. And they're really just a statement of purpose along with a few of the key competencies and probably the two or three main things that you're supposed to accomplish in this role. I think that the value exchange concept is an evolution of that because it is working at least two parties to some kind of activity or exchange seeking the value in it, and not only the value that would be uh, a social or an economic contribution to a cause or an initiative, but also value to the individual who's carrying out the work. And so I think that this is something that's pretty close to ground zero for a human being faced with I am being asked to do something or I want to do something that involves other people, information, and creating something. And it's about as simple as that. So if we were to look 50 years forward, I think you'll see more value exchange agreements and fewer job descriptions.
Gosh, I hope so.
Well, have you ever tried talking?
We won't be here to see it, but there you
Yeah,
go.
well, that doesn't matter. I mean, I have a 14-year-old son, John, and a 17-year-old daughter. But your comments at the beginning about the child you're mentoring, I feel every day I'm thinking, oh my goodness, how can I best prepare these kids? Because it's still very much at
Well,
school. It's old. It
I don't
feels quite
think we can,
old-fashioned.
other
But
than giving them what we think are
no,
good, or helping them grow what we think are good values, including an effective sense of self. Because the other thing that we're
yeah,
facing at the moment is an epidemic of young people having problems, having mental health problems, having emotional problems, and so on, and they're struggling to cope with this world that's out of date. Their parents still reminding them to do their work, and it's important to have good grades to get a good job, and so on. And they're looking around and saying, "I'm not sure my parents know what they're talking about." Well, I'm serious about that.
no, no, no. I agree. Just laughing because I'm
Yeah.
one of those parents. Although I'm, a little less and less on the academic thing. I sort of, I feel I've learned it's only one thing that you do in
Well,
your life, and there are other things that
yeah,
matter
it's a
massively.
really interesting issue. And I'll return to my story. I had wanted to say something about stories earlier when you asked the question, but um, again, I mentioned my brother and my nephew were just here for a week, and my brother's life mission for a lot of the last 25 or 30 years has been, um, he's been very anxious economically, and it's pretty darn secure. Uh, but he keeps on saying, I'm doing this for my son because I don't want my son to face the anxieties that I have. So, he's now, uh, I don't know how much longer my brother will live, but let's say inside 10 years, uh, my nephew, who's an only child, will inherit uh, a house worth $1.5 million and probably a couple $1 million worth of investments, from his parents. And at the same time, there has not been a lot of pressure put on him to get a job or find his way. So, he went to university once when he was about 18 or 19, and that didn't work out for a couple of years. He's now back and almost finished university, but he's, going to be 28. And the issue I worry about, I don't worry much about it because it's not really my concern. And my brother does a bit, but not so much, is that if you don't have, and maybe this is old person think, I don't know. If you don't have challenges to overcome that you address by yourselves, like my brother and I basically paid our own way from when we were 17 on, then, do you learn the resilience, the gumption, the grit, the stick-to-itiveness to get through more difficult situations that are likely to occur in life? Or do you think unconsciously or semi-consciously that just because I'm secure and so on, I'm okay? And I think people will do that, and that can often lead to an uninteresting life with not too many challenges. I keep saying, I said to my nephew a couple times when he was here, well, the smart thing for you to do will be to, you can do whatever you want when you're in a situation like that, but for God's sake, take a few $100,000 and place it somewhere it's interest bearing, so that, at a minimum, your basic needs of shelter and food will be taken care of, even if you turn out to be a blithering idiot. Well,
I'm taking that advice. I'm going to pass it on.
Yeah, but he's lucky in that he'll have those resources available to him.
Yeah.
Most people won't.
Yeah. No, of course.
No. And that brings up another issue,
excellent.
which is the huge and disgusting and growing levels of inequity or inequality in our society. Britain's a really good one for that.
It's a specialism.
Money laundering brought all the boys to the yard.
Right. I'm conscious that we've had 50
really?
minutes, which is a long time already. Yeah, time is flying. Rob, do you want to round
really
us up?
quiet.
Or?
I just wanted to thank you, Jon, for sharing your insights. I think that they're really important insights, and I wanted to let you reflect and talk and not talk over you. And the reason I haven't said anything is not because I can't talk for England. I can. And the fact I'm not talking is quite odd. But I just wanted to let you talk really freely. And just big thank you for sharing your insights, which, as always, I think are wonderful. So let's just say goodbye. Until the next time, everyone, say goodbye. Thank you. Bye.